the rib which Adonai God had taken from the person, he made a woman person. And he brought her to the man person. And the man person said, at last, Ruah, this is bone for my bones and flesh for my flesh. She is to be called woman, Isha, because she was taken out of man, Ish. And this is why a man is to leave his father and mother and stick with his wife. And they are to be one flesh. They were both naked, the man and his wife, and they weren't ashamed. Now, why is this passage so significant for understanding God's blueprint for marriage? Well, first of all, because here God declares his intentions for male and female relationships at the beginning of creation. As God created the heavens and the earth, he instituted things that would be a part of his creation for as long as his creation will exist. Things such as natural laws. And along with these natural laws, God ordained how the relationship between man and woman would be. Second, this is an important passage because it comes before the fall of humankind, which is recorded in Bereshit or Genesis 3. Now, some people try to say that the relationship between men and women, well, they might have been different if sin had not entered the world and God's marriage arrangement was a result or punishment for the fall. But we can clearly see that God's blueprint for marriage was given before we messed things up in the fall. So then, what is God's blueprint for sexuality and marriage? Well, verse 24 reveals three important parts of God's plan. First, we learn that a man shall leave his father and mother. We call this leaving, obviously. And the leaving part is significant as the husband and wife, they leave their parents, they leave their families to establish a new entity, a new family. Marriage has always been a public event, and every culture on earth has always been had a specific point at which persons clearly left the single life for married life. Leaving. Second, we learn from this passage that a man shall then be joined with his wife. We call this cleaving. The cleaving part means that the two shall hold fast to one another in a permanent relationship. God intended for this union to be exclusive, inseparable. A relationship between just one man and one woman for life. And third, we learn from this passage, brothers and sisters, that they shall become, what's the word in Hebrew? Echad. Echad, or one flesh. And we call this becoming, because it's a process. Now, one flesh means a husband and wife come together in unity and completion. While there is some mystery surrounding this concept, it is not just some poetic figure of speech. God is saying two people will actually become one entity. One entity. One flesh also has significant meaning concerning the sexual relationship. I love verse 25. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. See, the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife delivers perfect intimacy without shame or regret. God's blueprint for marriage is consistent in the Brit Chadashah. When the Pharisees tried to trap Yeshua with their questions about divorce in Matthew 19 or Yahoo 19, Yeshua took them right back to the creation narrative of Genesis 2, because there we clearly find God's will for sexuality and marriage. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2, these are the words Rabbi Shaul wrote on the matter. He said, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Now our Brit Hadashah, our New Testament portion from Hebrews 13 that Vic read for us, chapter 13 verse 4, declares that marriage is honorable in every respect. And in particular, sex within marriage is pure, but God will indeed punish fornicators and adulterers. So how is the marriage bed then kept honorable, you might be asking? Marriage is honored and the marriage bed kept pure by avoiding sexual immorality before marriage and adultery while being married. So this is God's basic blueprint that comes up again and again in Scripture. God intends what? Intends for a man to leave his family, be married to his wife, and that the two establish their own home and be faithful to each other as they grow in oneness. Do you remember the encounter that Yeshua had with the Samaritan woman? And that was in John or Yochanan chapter 4. See, in this passage, Yeshua, he's hanging out by the well in Samaria, while we could basically say in modern vernacular, it was a bar. He's hanging out at the bar, and he encounters a woman that comes near to draw water, and displaying his love and grace. He's probably he's just coming to get a drink. And displaying his grace and love, Yeshua broke down the giant social barriers of his time between men and women, and between Jews and Samaritans, by reaching out in conversation to this woman. How you doing? Great, okay. And so the Samaritan woman had no idea. She had no idea who Yeshua was. But in his infinite wisdom, he knew who she was, and he was about to tell her, basically who he was. Yeshua often used an area of common ground when he tried to relate to someone. So as this woman begins to drink her drink, or drink the water from the well, Yeshua asked her for a drink. And then proceeded to tell her that he is the living water. He is the living water, that she should ask him for a drink. This deep conversation would have gone over anyone's head, and it did hers. So what did she do? She did what any woman would do in that day, and that's why she would look to her husband. So Yeshua told her then to call for her husband and have him come, because this is the role of the husband, to share with his wife about the ways and the desires of Hashem. That's what that culture is all about. It's a patriarchal culture, and our faith is patriarchal, and it's the responsibility as men and the priests of the home to share the gospel, to share the Torah, to share the good news with his wife and his children and his family. And so so he asked her to call for her husband to come, because that's the role of a husband. And after stating that she had no husband, which of course Yeshua knew, he says, yeah, you're right. You're right. I know that. You've had 5 different husbands. And the man you are living with is not your husband. And here we have a situation of cohabitation in the Bible. And there are many, many, many important lessons that we can learn from this encounter. But for our purposes this morning, this Shabbat, and the subject I'm speaking on today, I want us to notice this: how Yeshua addressed this woman who was cohabitating, shacking up, living in sin, living together, whatever word you want to use, with a man, unmarried. This woman was living a life that was far outside of God's plan. Oh, she would have tried to argue differently, and I'm certain that women and men today would wish to argue differently. And Yeshua, though, he knew better, and he wanted to bring her back in line with God's will, with his Torah. This woman's life had been caught up in one bad relationship after another. Isn't that how it always happens? One abusive relationship into the next abusive relationship. The pattern always continues and repeats itself. Husband after husband, and the man she was currently living with was not her husband. And we notice that Yeshua made a clear distinction between the men who had been her husbands. He pointed that out. Yes, he did. And the man she presently lived with, whom Yeshua did not consider a husband. And this is an important distinction. In doing so, Yeshua did not, let me repeat that, in making this distinction, Yeshua did not affirm living together. He did not affirm cohabitation. He did not affirm shacking up. He did not affirm a mutual arrangement. He did not affirm cohabitation as a good alternative to marriage. No, he didn't do that. Nor did he affirm that living together makes people married in God's sight. There are many common reasons given for why living together before marriage is considered okay, or even a good idea, or even something they must do. Let's think through some of these common defenses, because whenever you have this discussion with anybody who's living together, they obviously have some reason that they justify why this is a good idea. And so let's look at these defenses in light of God's will. Let's look at these defenses in light of God's perfect blueprint for marriage. One common reason given is, well, cohabitation or living together is a good way to prepare for marriage. Prepare for marriage. And this sounds, I guess, in the surface, rather logical and reasonable, but it's a myth. It's a myth that could not be any further from the truth. Let's look at just some secular research right here. Marriages that are formed after people have lived together are rated as less stable and result in more divorces than marriages not preceded by living together. One stat was 80% of those who had lived together before marriage were more likely to experience divorce, and couple that with somebody who's been married more than once. For even the stat, if you've been married a second time or a third time, those rates go up 75-80% for a subsequent divorce. So you throw those mixes together, and you got basically an explosive situation for divorce. Infidelity during marriage is more common. Yeah, cheating is more common among people who lived together prior to marriage than those who did not. And there are reasons for that, because obviously the reason they didn't get married is because they don't trust each other. People who live together before marriage have lower levels of marital satisfaction than those who did not live together. In fact, a recent study of 17,024 couples, they found that couples that had lived together had significantly lower premarital satisfaction compared to couples where the two people still lived alone before marriage. And this is significant because the premarital relationship is predictive of later marital success. Let me repeat that. The premarital relationship, what went on before you got married, is predictive of later marital success. And why would that be so? Well, because living together says something. Oh, you think it's just an arrangement. But think about it. What does it really communicate? Living together clearly communicates an admission that you think there's really a good chance this relationship isn't going to work out. No, this is not a good idea. So you want to have one foot in, one foot out. You want to have an escape clause. And also it's an admission because living together is basically, you're saying you don't fully trust your fiancé. You don't truly trust them enough to commit. Because you might be engaged in living together first. An admission that you really don't think it's going to work out. That's why people live together. That's at the heart of living together. But I don't want to base our arguments upon living together on secular stats alone. No, because when we're dealing with God's truths and things that God ordains, statistics don't mean a thing. No, they don't. What matters is doing God's things God's way. And hypothetically, even 100% of all couples who lived together had a wonderful marriage, a happy cohabitating relationship, and then a happy future marriage, that still would not make it okay in God's eyes. Just because it worked out, still, God is not pleased. God doesn't evaluate statistics to determine right and wrong. He's already established from the beginning what is right or wrong. And the second common reason, well, it's because we love each other. He said he loved me. He said he loved me, so all the reason more just to jump in bed and into his house. And I would say that if you love each other, then the greatest expression of that love is not to do those very things. The greatest expression of that love is to commit yourself. To commit yourself one to another in marriage. Since God is a source of love, if God is love, and the creator of marriage, and the only way our relationships will ever truly be loving, truly fulfilling, is by doing them God's way. Marriage is not some restrictive, burdensome rule from God to somehow stifle the fun of being together. No, it's exactly the opposite. God provided his guidelines for marriage in order to maximize the relationship's love for our spouse and to give us the greatest possible joy. The most fulfilling love and joy we can have with another person is found where? It's found in marriage. In addition to being used for living together, this excuse It's also used for premarital sex. We need to understand that true love is the greatest reason to avoid this. True love would never seek the spiritual downfall of another, which is what results from hooking up before you're married. True love would be unselfish. It would place God's will and the needs of others above self. Beyond just looking at the big picture of life, the real question is not, do you love the other person? No. That's not the big question. The big question, the ultimate question is, do you love God? Do you love God? If we really love God, then we will seek to honor and obey God. And if we love God, then we'll want to honor and obey God's will for purity and the sanctity of marriage. So if we really love our God, we really love our girlfriend or boyfriend, then the last thing that we would want to do is be involved in premarital activity and living together. And then there's a third reason. Besides prepping for marriage or we love each other, the third reason is, well, we plan to get married anyway. Eventually. And how naive can this be? Because it's nothing but presumptuous. Do you have any idea what the other person is really going to do? You think you do. You're trusting that they're going to honor their word. So it's basically, you're putting your faith not in God, but in another person with wishful and naive and presumptuous thinking. And as I mentioned earlier, statistics show that about half the people, 50% of people who live together will never get married. But even if it is true that you're going to be married, and maybe you actually go through with it, you do get married because God views cohabitation as sin, well, guess what? Your future marriage does not make right what you're doing now. And what if I had a problem, let's say, with shoplifting? Yeah, let's say I have a problem with shoplifting. Am I saying to God, well, yeah, God, I know stealing is wrong in your eyes, but look, I plan on quitting sometime in the future. Maybe I'll quit next year. Does God say, well, look, if you're going to stop in the future, go ahead, keep shoplifting now, because you're going to do it right later? Is that what he says? I don't think so. God doesn't say to a couple living together out of marriage, well, because you had the invitations to the wedding in the mail, it's okay for you to shack up now. Go ahead. No, living together is wrong. It's wrong in God's eyes, and just like all other sins, it needs to be repented of sooner rather than later. Now there's a fourth common reason that is given, and this is probably the most delusional of them. Well, we are married in God's eyes. What an amazing thing to say, that somehow you're determinative of what God thinks. You are married in God's eyes. So what does it matter if we have a marriage license because it's just a piece of paper? A statement like that brings up, well, a couple different issues. A couple of different biblical issues. First of all, God told us what? He told us to be submissive to the authorities because God is ordained and works through the government, as Rabbi Shaul or Paul taught in Romans 13. As long as the government is not demanding us to do something that is directly contrary to God's authority or his perfect will, then we are to be good citizens and we are to follow the law of the land. And even though the most important aspect of marriage is the spiritual aspect, there is also a legal aspect. A legal aspect that is important. Honestly, many who cohabitate or live together are really trying to avoid this legal aspect and are trying to leave themselves an easy way out of the relationship, an easy way out if necessary. That's what you call a prenuptial. Cover your butt in case it doesn't work out. Again, there is that unspoken admission that you don't think it's going to work, that this person can't be trusted, that this is going to go the long haul. Now, a second issue about that defense has to do with this truth. Cohabitating or living together couples are not married in God's eyes. First, it's not just a piece of paper. And second of all, you're not married in God's eyes because you are living contrary to the Bible and legal guidelines or biblical legal guidelines for marriage. They are not married in their own eyes because they specifically decided not to marry. So what an irony. We're married in God's eyes, according to them, but they're not married. No, no, it doesn't work that way. A man and a woman are married in God's eyes when they publicly make a covenant. And you've heard me speak about covenant. I've walked through the 10 steps of the covenant process and what that entails and what that involves. Some of you are very cognizant of the significance of covenant. And so when we marry, we're making a public declaration for God to be faithful to our spouse in marriage and legalize the marriage according to the government that we are living in. In God's eyes, adultery and fornication are called sin. And the terms of adultery and fornication are completely meaningless concepts apart from God's definition of marriage. Now there's a fifth common reason. A fifth common reason for cohabitation. It's very, very popular these days, both for young and old. And this reason is we have to do it for financial reasons. And often it isn't out of need. No, it's out of greed. It's out of greed. Those who cohabitate are most often younger people. However, more and more seniors are following their example. Both generations use the same argument, the same defense. Well, it saves money. See, with the younger ones, it's usually an issue of paying bills. And of course, the reason they have so many bills is because they want it now. They don't want to do things the right way. They don't want to do it God's way. So they crank up bills, and now they find themselves in a place where they got to pay these bills. So they get together and they share expenses. But the older ones, it's often an issue of keeping individual pensions or Social Security benefits that they might lose if they were married. Now we got to ask ourselves. We got to ask ourselves: is the monetary savings, is the greed worth the loss of morality and spirituality? And hear me when I tell you this. Hear me clearly when I say this. What is right and wrong is never determined by what makes the most sense economically. What is right and what is wrong is never determined upon economical reasons. God has promised to provide all our needs if we seek first His kingdom. So the question for you this morning is, do you trust Him? Do you trust Him? Because it takes faith. Do you have that kind of faith to believe that He's going to do what He says He's going to do? That He will supply all your needs? That He will meet it? Meet that need according to His riches and glory. You know the final common reason to hook up, to live together? And this is one that, well, most use. Well, you wouldn't buy a car without a test drive, would you? Many couples think living together will help them test their relationship. They call it a trial marriage, but it's really a euphemism for a trial divorce. Did I say that? Yes, I did. Testing your marriage is really just a euphemism for a test for divorce, a trial divorce. See, a test drive is a good rule for buying a car, but it is not a good way to deal with people. If I decide not to buy a car after a test drive, the car doesn't feel rejected, does it? No. No, it doesn't. Rejecting a car doesn't cause that car to bring emotional damage to the next test drive. The car doesn't need psychological counseling so it can trust the next car buyer, because really that's the issue when people live together, because they've been burned before, they've tried it before, and it failed, so we're going to keep trying and trying, and what you end up doing, the trial drive ends up being another trial breakup and another trial divorce. And lives are shattered, your children are wounded, and they follow your example. You know, it's very, very interesting to me. One question that I saw seen in the net post on this issue of living together was this question: if you're so sure that living together is the right thing to do, well, ask yourself this question. In 15 years, when your daughter is a teenager, how will you feel when she looks you in the eyes and says, hey, I think it's a good idea that I hook up and move in with my boyfriend? Would that be okay with you? Since this is a good thing to do, would that be something that you would approve of? Would you be on board with that? Because that's really the better way of getting into a relationship. I wonder. if we're completely honest, this test driving a car way of thinking, I think is rather selfish. It's selfish. Instead of putting God first, or even putting the other person first, ahead of ourselves, this lack of commitment really is saying, put me first. Yes. If you're getting in a situation where the person wants to move in with you or live together with you, then that screams self. Self. There's no concern about you. It's concern about them. And it has to do with what I want. It has to do what I think is best for me. God's way means we look to God and we look to His plan for marriage above all things. And it means making a commitment to the other person by entering the marriage covenant. Marriage is it's not just about feelings, brothers and sisters. It's not just about feelings and preferences and compatibility. And these are all important. But marriage, first and foremost, is about sacrifice and commitment. This is a big subject, in conclusion, that has a lot of implications for individuals, a lot of implications for our families, our children, a lot of implications for those we fellowship with, our brothers and sisters, a lot of implications for the culture and society we live in. But I want to end on a positive note. God's commands and principles are always given why? They're given for our best interest. The Torah is for our best interest. God's ways are the best ways for us, and we've got to trust Him in that. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 24 through 25 puts it this way. Adonai ordered us to observe all these laws, to fear Adonai our God, always for our own good, so that He might keep us alive as we are today. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to obey all these mitzvot before Adonai our God, just as He ordered us to do so. We must decide that our highest priority and commitment is to do what? Well, think about somebody else besides ourselves first. Think about the Lord most importantly, to glorify and honor and obey Hashem in everything. And I want to encourage you this morning. To first examine yourself, to see if there is something that we must do today to make things right with Hashem. To make it right. As I said earlier, most of you consider this a good idea. Well, I'm asking you to reconsider that. I'm asking you to be bold, to speak out. There might be a brother and sister right now who are living together. There might be a brother or sister that are considering it. You do them no good to help them in the process. You do them no good to move them. You do them no good to say, well, who am I to judge? No, it's times like this that brothers and sisters of the Lord, that friends go running in and they speak the truth in love. It's time for you to stand on God and stand on His principles for these brothers and sisters, because they're moving together, they are sowing the wind. And how would it be for us to watch them reap the whirlwind and not doing anything to stop that from happening? Please pray with me.